Hello and welcome to episode 177 of the Book Binge, the second time that I'm recording this. Both today's video and next Tuesday's video are ones that I attempted to record for the first time yesterday while I was still having audio issues, and well, they were fine enough, sort of, but only if you're really okay with really crunchy audio that did not sound great. So this is me re-recording it because I finally got through to a point where my mic audio actually sounds okay and pretty much like what it did before. I'm finally satisfied with it. There's still some things that could be adjusted, but this is the re-recording. I thought that my previous attempt at this video was also pretty gnarly. It wasn't as good as I would have liked it to be, so this is the attempt to make it a little bit better. This video, of course, is what you saw in the title and the thumbnail, a review of Uzumaki by Junji Ito. I do this every single time. Junji Ito. I hope that's pronounced correctly. I always say it wrong. I'm sorry about that. This video is my second ever manga review video. It's the only third manga related video that I've made on the channel. So it's still pretty early on in this process, and this is very different from the last one of these that I did, which was Goodbye Eri by Tetsuki Fujimoto, I believe it was. This time, obviously changing the vibe a little bit. One of the things that was pretty exceptional about Goodbye Eri as my first manga review was that it holds the record for the most impressions of any individual video on my channel. So the most amount of times that any one of my videos has been promoted or put into people's recommended bars or suggested feed or whatever, anything like that, Goodbye Eri is the top, and it's like twice as much as the one in second place. So that is definitely a pretty big margin. We'll see how this video goes. I'm not necessarily making this video because I want to see that kind of success again, because, you know, while that video was successful, I was also definitely not expecting it to be as successful as it was. This one I'm just reviewing because this was the next manga that I read, and I want to occasionally cover manga stuff as I read it on this channel. So not going to be a regular thing, just as I said in those previous couple manga videos that I did. But yeah, this is what this video is. It's also why it's coming out on Thursday rather than Tuesday like normal book reviews do, because it's something a little bit different. So, Uzumaki by Junji Ito. Let's start off just like normal in any other book review that I post on this channel with the good of the story. There was plenty to like with Uzumaki. In fact, I quite enjoyed my time with it for the vast majority of the time that I spent. But the thing that this is probably most known for is definitely the thing to shout out the most loudly that is of good quality in the story, and that is the body horror. The actual artwork and story-related body horror is definitely the best part. Nearly everything that Ito does to make the body extra unsettling and weird, and to make it weird and unsettling in ways that isn't natural, is really great over the course of the story. And the further that you get along, not only the body horror, but also the way that integrates with the town in which the story is set in is also fantastic. I really loved almost everything to do with all of this stuff. We'll talk about basically the exception to that a little bit later in the bad. But for the most part, if you're somebody who's into horror and body horror easily, like just very early on in the video, I can say this is a pretty easy recommend. Ito does some pretty cool stuff with this story. My favorite moments of this entire manga, though, originally comprised of 3 volumes, but in this omnibus edition, is the moments when it is multiple chapters comprising story arcs. This is something that I actually struggled to express the previous time that I tried recording this video. I would say that my favorite moments, the times when the story really shined, were when multiple chapters in a row were telling a cohesive plot story, where like one individual part of it wasn't, you know, enough to get the full picture because it continued on into the next one. These moments were definitely my favorite of the story. There are some other chapters that were pretty good as well, but for the most part, the best examples of this are the first like 3 or 4 chapters are phenomenal, and they kind of tell a cohesive thing. The story starts to get a little bit more episodic, where each chapter is kind of doing its own individualized thing with a different concept associated with the titular spiral into horror motif. This motif recurs, but when things get a little bit more episodic, I'm not as into it. When things are a little bit less episodic, I like it a little bit more. So of course, like I just said, the first several chapters are definitely a part of this. So the first few of them are exceptional. Chapters 1 and 3 are like perfect, absolutely perfect. There's a part in volume 2, chapters 10 through 11 are also some favorites of mine where this is concerned, where those 2 chapters in my mind are basically one story. I wouldn't read chapter 10 without reading chapter 11 at the same time, for example. And then the finale of the whole story is another great example of how this all goes. And really, volume 3 in general is pretty good in that it's able to combine all of the disparate motifs and the different concepts that Ito is working with throughout the, the first 2 volumes, and combines them in such a way that it is effective and entertaining and also really horrifying in a quite unique way. I felt like in the end of the story, the last few chapters really start to see a culmination of stuff and something going a completely different direction than I was expecting, but still completely nailing the execution. I really liked some of that material. In fact, something that I tried to say but said it very poorly last time I tried to record this video was that it's not super often when an author is able to take, you along a road and like you kind of see what's coming, but you want it to go the other way, and you want it to go the other way so badly that even though you kind of see something that's coming, like it just escapes your brain. You just kind of forget that that's probably what's going to happen, and then he takes that path and you're like, oh no, I don't want it to go this way, but then still nails it, and you don't feel like you were cheated out of anything. You still really enjoyed what you got. You still felt like it was worth it. This is something that Ito does very well with Uzumaki, I would say. I really enjoyed all of that stuff. Also want to give a brief shout out to chapter 7 in volume 2 as well, which is one of the rare examples in this book of the episodic chapters that I actually really loved, in spite of it being more episodic. So that is basically what I have to say about the good. There might be another thing or two that I throw out throughout the, the next couple sections of this video, but we will get into the bad. I do think there are a couple less redeeming moments for the story. I still think the whole thing is mostly great, but there are a couple of minor problems that I did have with it. I did briefly hint at this a little bit earlier in the video, but generally speaking, the moments when Uzumaki is less cohesive over the course of several chapters and it's a little bit more episodic are definitely the moments that I am less into, the parts that I enjoyed the least out of everything in the whole, basically in the entire story. So a couple of the standout chapters in this regard are definitely chapters 8 and chapters 12, and actually these 2 are probably the weakest chapters in the whole story, and also for very different reasons, surprisingly enough. I mentioned and briefly hinted that we would get a little bit into where the body horror didn't work for me as we got on a little bit later. Chapter 8 is pretty much the example. The body horror concepts that Ito utilized in chapter 8 of the story didn't really work for me. I wasn't super into it the way that most of the other stuff I was actually really into or really enjoyed getting to be kind of grossed out by. We'll say chapter 8 just kind of was meh. Ironically enough, chapter 8's body horror example is actually utilized a little bit later in volume 3 to a degree that was kind of surprising. I would say I didn't necessarily dislike it so much the way that it was utilized a little bit later, but chapter 8 itself was one of my least favorite at the time when I read it. But my actual least favorite chapter was definitely chapter 12. But this one was, kind of a similar thing. It's actually setting up, in essence, it is setting up the entirety of how volume 3, goes about. The reason that volume 3 happens the way that it does is because of chapter 12. But chapter 12 was not the best. I think it just didn't utilize its concept to the full degree that I would have liked to see it be used. Like I said, some of those concepts, some of those elements are used more fully in part or in volume 3, but chapter 12 was just kind of mediocre. So there are moments of Uzumaki that are not in tip-top shape, even if there are some other very phenomenal sections as well to go along with it. So there's a little bit of hit and miss nature to Uzumaki, I would say. Don't come out of this section, however, thinking that I disliked anything about Uzumaki. I still thought the chapters were good, just not fully my thing, and everything else that I didn't necessarily shout out is still pretty great, all things considered. I really enjoyed it. So there's just, a couple moments that don't shine like the rest. So if you get to a chapter that's just like, oh, this wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, or something like that, just know that you're not alone. I kind of had a couple of these problems now and again as well. For the ugly, Well, let's talk a little bit more on a personal front. Horror and body horror is something that I'm a little bit more sensitive to, in the sense that, like, I haven't been exposed to a lot of horror medium stories in general over the course of my life, so it's like something that I've always been fascinated by, but it's something that generally more deeply affects me while reading books than other people. So something like, say, Salem's Lot, where a lot of people read that. It's the book by Stephen King. People say, like, oh yeah, this is one of King's scariest books. It's, you know, pretty terrifying. I would go in there and say, yeah, well, I think it's a little bit overhyped. Scariness in books is pretty subjective. Same thing as humor. Horror can also be pretty subjective according to the reader, but Salem's Lot did also have some very terrifying scenes for me that other people would probably laugh at me for having been terrified by them. I don't know. The point is that horror isn't necessarily something that I have a ton of experience with, so I figured that having the little bit more visual medium, I'm definitely more sensitive to visual mediums. That's where things tend to get me, we'll say. Uzumaki I thought would be a lot rougher for me as a reading experience because it is manga, and therefore most of the story is told through the visual medium. I thought a lot of the visceral nature of it would hit me a little bit harder and affect me a little bit more coming out of having finished it, but I would say I don't really think about this in any form of like legitimately scary context. Now, if you're somebody who is extremely sensitive to body horror, like you really hate that kind of thing, or it's something that actually really affects you, like mentally or in terms of say bad mental images now and again, it's hard to sleep or something like that, Uzumaki actually gets pretty gnarly in several places, and chapters 10 through 11 especially are actually like pretty gross. The story does get pretty gnarly. I would say that the ugly is that I was expecting to be more affected by this and I wasn't, so that's actually a good thing, even though I put it in the ugly, but that's something to consider as well. Just kind of know your limits. If the first like 2 chapters, say, if you cannot abide what Ito is doing in the first couple chapters, then don't really continue. That is where the body horror comes into things, and basically my recommendations on that front. That said, though, I do think that because the anime version of Uzumaki is supposedly coming this month in September 2024, who would have thought, ironic the timing on that, I do think that that will actually affect me. So where the manga didn't, I think the anime might. So this is kind of one of my introductions of sorts into the manga medium. I think that this anime version might be basically my introduction into anime and actually watching something like that. And I think that depending on how it's executed, it'll be rightly terrifying and really horrific, you know, basically everything that you would probably expect from an adaptation of Uzumaki if you've read it. All of that said, what is my ultimate recommendation of Uzumaki? Well, I think the balance of things comes out to the fact that I do recommend Uzumaki. If you are a fan of horror in any way, I think that Uzumaki is definitely pretty cool. I thought it was enjoyable. If you are not a fan of horror, I doubt that Uzumaki would change your mind. So if you're super not into that type of thing, it's not necessarily a must read for you. But if you're interested, and especially if you like manga, then this might actually be a pretty good starting point, because while there are some things that are pretty visceral, pretty gnarly, certain relatively horrifying concepts in here, most of everything follows the spiral motif, so you kind of see some things coming as you know before they actually ever hit. So a lot of the things in here are not going to be too crazy, I think, for somebody who's like not very well versed in horror. And if you're interested in, I think this could actually be a good place to go with it. But of course, I'm very unfamiliar with manga as a medium, so who knows if I know what I'm talking about. I probably don't. In fact, I would argue that I absolutely do not know what I'm talking about. But that is it for this video, my second ever manga review on the channel. Thank you for watching it if you did. I'm sorry if the audio is still a little bit rougher than you're kind of used to over the last several months of the channel being a thing. Like I said, I've been running with issues and I've had to fix things, so this is definitely by far the best that it's been over the last couple weeks while trying to do tests. So I apologize if there's still something wrong in there, but yeah, that is it for this video. Thank you for watching yet again. If you did, I'll be back. Will I be back this Sunday? I don't think I'll be back this Sunday with any video, so next Tuesday will be my my failures review. yeah, my review of this debut novel that I absolutely loved. Another video that I tried recording yesterday and am re-recording right after I'm done re-recording this one. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend checking out that video. Or if you can't wait for it, or if you don't care about the video, you can check out the 2,500 word review that I wrote for it over on Goodreads. But that is it. I'm going to stop rambling now. Thank you for watching. I'll be back next week.